My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and I built my life from the ground up in ways my family never understood or acknowledged. At 42, I owned a successful software consulting firm in Kansas City, Missouri, with 37 employees and clients across the Midwest. I drove a BMW, lived in a penthouse overlooking the Missouri River, and had more money in my savings account than my parents had seen in their entire lifetimes combined. Yet none of that seemed to matter when it came to earning their respect or recognition. Growing up in Springfield, Missouri, I was always the odd one out in the Mitchell family. My parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, were simple people who valued traditional paths and conventional choices. Dad worked at the Ford plant for 43 years, punching the same time clock every morning at 6:30 sharp. Mom stayed home, tending to the house and raising my 3 siblings with the kind of devotion that small-town communities still celebrated. They lived in a brick ranch house on Elm Street, surrounded by neighbors who had known each other for decades, where everyone went to the same Methodist church, and Friday night football games were sacred community events. I was different from the start. While my older brother Danny followed Dad into factory work, and my twin sisters, Lisa and Laura, married their high school sweethearts straight after graduation, I had bigger dreams. I spent my teenage years with my nose buried in computer programming books, teaching myself languages like COBOL and Pascal when most girls my age were focused on cheerleading and prom dresses. The local library became my sanctuary, its quiet corners filled with technology magazines and business journals that transported me beyond the limited horizons of small-town Missouri. My parents never understood my ambitions. They saw my academic achievements as impractical and my career goals as unrealistic for someone from our background. When I earned a full scholarship to the University of Missouri for computer science, they seemed more worried about me getting too big for my britches than proud of my accomplishment. During family dinners, they would shake their heads when I talked about starting my own business someday, making comments about how I should focus on finding a good husband instead of chasing pipe dreams. The divide became even more pronounced after college. While my siblings settled down within a 20-mile radius of Springfield, starting families and maintaining the close-knit dynamic my parents cherished, I moved to Kansas City to pursue opportunities in the growing tech sector. I rented a tiny studio apartment in the Crossroads Arts District, surviving on ramen noodles and determination while I worked 80-hour weeks at a startup that eventually went public. The money I made from my stock options became the foundation for my own company, which I launched at 28, with nothing but a laptop, a business plan, and an unshakable belief in my own abilities. Success came gradually, then all at once. My firm specialized in helping traditional Midwest businesses modernize their operations through custom software solutions. We worked with manufacturing companies, agricultural cooperatives, and retail chains throughout Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. The irony was not lost on me that I was helping businesses similar to the ones my family worked for, yet they still viewed my career as mysterious and somehow less legitimate than honest manual labor. Family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable as my financial situation improved. My parents would introduce Danny as their son, who managed the maintenance department at the plant, and Lisa and Laura as their daughters who were raising beautiful families. When it came to me, they would simply say I worked with computers, as if the specifics were too complicated or unimportant to explain. The expensive gifts I brought for birthdays and holidays were accepted with awkward gratitude, as if my money somehow carried a taint they preferred not to acknowledge. The distance between us was not just geographical. My parents had created a narrative about their family that centered on traditional values, hard work, and staying close to home. In their version of the story, success was measured by stability, community involvement, and raising the next generation. My achievements did not fit neatly into that framework, so they were either minimized or ignored entirely. I became the family member they mentioned reluctantly, the one whose lifestyle choices they could not quite explain to their friends at church. This dynamic became especially painful during family crises. When Danny went through his divorce 3 years ago, my parents rallied around him with emotional and financial support. When Lisa needed help with her mortgage payments after her husband lost his job, they dipped into their retirement savings without hesitation. When Laura's son needed surgery for a broken leg, they organized fundraisers at their church and asked everyone in the family to contribute. But when I offered to help in these situations, my money was accepted with a strange reluctance, as if they preferred to struggle rather than rely on their successful daughter. I tried for years to bridge the gap. I attended every Christmas dinner, every birthday celebration, every graduation ceremony for my nieces and nephews. I listened patiently to stories about people I had never met, local gossip about neighbors whose names I could barely remember, and complaints about politicians and social changes that seemed to threaten their comfortable worldview. I bit my tongue when they made dismissive comments about my unmarried status, my childless state, and my decision to prioritize career over family in ways they could not comprehend. The truth was, I loved my parents deeply, despite our differences. I admired Dad's work ethic and reliability, even if I had chosen a different path. I respected Mom's dedication to her family and community, even if I wanted something more expansive for my own life. I had hoped that time would help them understand my choices, that success would eventually earn me the recognition I craved from the people whose opinion mattered most to me. That hope was about to be tested in the most devastating way possible. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, while I was reviewing quarterly projections in my corner office overlooking the Missouri River. The autumn light was filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden shadows across the polished conference table where I had closed million-dollar deals and hired dozens of talented employees. My assistant knocked tentatively on the door, her usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Rebecca, you have a call from Cox Medical Center in Springfield. They said it was urgent regarding your parents." My hands went cold as I picked up the phone. The voice on the other end belonged to a social worker named Patricia Williams, whose professional compassion could not quite mask the gravity of what she had to tell me. My parents had been involved in a head-on collision on Highway 65, just outside of Springfield. A drunk driver had crossed the median during the afternoon commute, hitting their pickup truck at 60 miles per hour. Dad died instantly from massive trauma. Mom survived long enough to be airlifted to the hospital, but succumbed to her injuries 3 hours later without regaining consciousness. The next few hours passed in a surreal blur of phone calls, travel arrangements, and devastating conversations with my siblings. Danny, who still lived in Springfield, had already been contacted by the police and was handling the immediate logistics with the hospital and coroner. Lisa and Laura, both living in nearby communities, were rushing to be with their families and begin the painful process of making funeral arrangements. As the only one living more than an hour away, I felt simultaneously included in the tragedy and somehow separate from the immediate circle of grief. I canceled all my meetings, delegated urgent projects to my senior staff, and made the 3-hour drive to Springfield in a state of numb shock. The familiar route along Interstate 44 seemed different somehow, as if the landscape itself had shifted to accommodate this new reality where my parents no longer existed. The rolling hills and farmland of central Missouri, which had always represented the limitations I had worked so hard to escape, now felt like the final barrier between me and a reckoning I was not prepared to face. Springfield looked exactly the same as it had during my last visit 6 months earlier, but everything felt changed. The modest downtown with its mix of historic buildings and modern storefronts, the tree-lined residential streets where I had learned to ride a bike and delivered newspapers, the high school where I had been valedictorian but never homecoming queen, all of it seemed frozen in time while my world had been completely altered by a single phone call. I drove directly to the house on Elm Street, where Danny's truck was already parked in the driveway alongside several other vehicles I recognized as belonging to family, friends, and neighbors. The front yard looked immaculate, as always, with Mom's carefully tended flower beds, and Dad's precisely edged lawn creating the kind of suburban perfection that had felt suffocating to me as a teenager, but now seemed heartbreakingly fragile. The front door opened before I could knock, and Lisa emerged with red-rimmed eyes and the exhausted expression of someone who had been crying for hours. She hugged me tightly, and for a moment we were just sisters grieving the loss of our parents, without the complicated dynamics that usually defined our relationship. "They were coming back from grocery shopping," she whispered against my shoulder. Mom had called me an hour before to ask about Emily's birthday party this weekend. They were talking about what kind of cake to buy for their granddaughter. Inside the house, the living room was filled with people offering condolences and bringing covered dishes, following the timeless ritual of small-town communities responding to tragedy. I recognized many of the faces from my childhood: neighbors, church members, family friends who had known my parents for decades. They greeted me with the kind of awkward sympathy reserved for family members who had become virtual strangers, acknowledging my loss while clearly unsure of my role in the immediate family circle. Danny was sitting at the kitchen table with Laura and several other relatives, surrounded by notebooks, phone books, and the kind of paperwork that accompanies sudden death. He looked up when I entered, his face showing the strain of trying to coordinate funeral arrangements while processing his own grief. "The funeral home needs to know about the service by tomorrow morning," he said without preamble. "We've been trying to figure out what Mom and Dad would have wanted." I pulled out a chair and sat down, immediately feeling the weight of unspoken expectations. This was familiar territory for our family. Important decisions made by committee, with my input welcomed but not necessarily prioritized. The difference this time was that I had resources my siblings lacked, resources that could make the difference between a modest service and something truly meaningful. "What are you thinking in terms of budget?" I asked carefully. The question hung in the air for a moment, creating the kind of uncomfortable silence that had characterized so many of our family discussions over the years. Danny shifted in his chair, exchanging glances with Laura before responding. "We've looked at some basic packages. Something simple but respectful. We can all chip in what we can manage." I knew what that meant. Danny made decent money at the plant, but he was still paying off his divorce and supporting 2 teenage sons. Lisa worked part-time at a dental office while raising 3 young children. Laura's husband had been laid off from his construction job 6 months earlier, and they were barely making ends meet. A basic funeral package would mean a simple casket, minimal flowers, and a brief service in the funeral home's smallest chapel. "What if we did something bigger?" I suggested. "Something that really honors who they were and means something to the community. I can cover the costs." The silence that followed was even more uncomfortable than the first one. I could see the internal struggle playing out on my siblings' faces, gratitude for my offer competing with pride, and perhaps some resentment about my ability to solve problems with money they could not afford to spend. "That's generous of you, Rebecca," Danny said finally. "But we don't want to make this about money. We want it to be about family." The implication stung, even though I was sure he had not intended it that way. In our family's logic, spending more money somehow made the funeral less authentic, less meaningful, less connected to the values my parents had cherished. My success, which I had worked so hard to achieve, was once again being treated as a complication rather than an asset. "I understand that," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "But they deserved better than basic. They spent their whole lives working hard and sacrificing for other people. This is our chance to give them the kind of send-off that reflects how much they meant to all of us." Lisa spoke up from across the table, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe we could find something in the middle. Not too fancy, but nice enough to feel special." We spent the next 2 hours negotiating details that felt both important and trivial. The type of casket, the arrangement of flowers, the location of the service, the catering for the reception afterward. Each decision required consensus, and each consensus required me to downplay my preferences in favor of what my siblings considered appropriate. I found myself in the familiar position of having the most resources but the least influence in determining how those resources would be used. By the time we reached a compromise, we had settled on a service that was certainly more elaborate than what my siblings could have afforded on their own, but still more modest than what I thought my parents deserved. The funeral would be held at Greenlawn Memorial Chapel, Springfield's largest funeral home, with a service in their main chapel, followed by burial at East Lawn Cemetery. There would be a catered reception at the funeral homes afterward, with enough food and flowers to accommodate the large crowd we expected from my parents' extensive network of friends and community connections. The total cost came to just over $15,000, which I agreed to pay in full despite my siblings' insistence that they would contribute what they could. I wrote the check that evening, sitting alone in my childhood bedroom that had been converted into Mom's sewing room years earlier. The familiar floral wallpaper and handmade quilts created a shrine to the domestic life I had never wanted, but suddenly missed with an intensity that surprised me. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation and receiving visitors. The house on Elm Street became a gathering place for everyone who had known my parents, with a steady stream of neighbors, co-workers, church members, and distant relatives offering condolences and sharing memories. I found myself in the strange position of being both insider and outsider. Clearly part of the family, but somehow peripheral to the stories being told about my parents' lives and impact on their community. People remembered Dad as a reliable co-worker who never missed a day of work in 4 decades, a man who volunteered his mechanical skills to help neighbors fix everything from lawnmowers to leaky faucets. They remembered Mom as a devoted church member who organized potluck dinners and visited shut-ins, a woman who could be counted on to bring a casserole to any family facing illness or hardship. These were the stories that defined my parents' legacy in the eyes of their community. Small acts of service and kindness that had created ripples of gratitude throughout Springfield. I listened to these stories with a mixture of pride and sadness, recognizing my parents in these descriptions, while also feeling the absence of my own connection to their daily lives. I had been so focused on building my own success that I had missed years of the small moments that had defined who they really were. The realization that I knew my parents' public personas better than their private thoughts and feelings became another layer of grief to process. The evening before the funeral, our extended family gathered at the house for a private viewing and final preparations. The caskets had been delivered that afternoon, solid oak with brass fittings, more expensive than anything my parents had ever owned, but still modest compared to the top-tier options I had wanted to choose. Floral arrangements filled the living room, creating a garden of sympathy that transformed the familiar space into something formal and ceremonial. As we stood around the caskets, taking turns saying private goodbyes, I was struck by how peaceful my parents looked. The trauma of the accident was not visible in their faces, which had been restored to a dignity that honored their memory. Dad looked distinguished in his best suit, the one he had worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. Mom was beautiful in the blue dress she had bought for Lisa's wedding, her hands folded over the small Bible she had carried since her confirmation 60 years earlier. Danny stepped forward to speak for all of us, as the eldest son and the one who had remained closest to home. His voice was steady, despite his obvious emotion as he talked about what our parents had meant to each of us and to the broader community. He spoke about Dad's work ethic and integrity, Mom's generosity and faith, and the example they had set for all of us about living a life of service and devotion to family. When he finished, there was a moment of silence that felt both respectful and expectant. I realized that this was my opportunity to add my own tribute, to share my perspective on who my parents had been and what they had meant to me. But the words felt stuck in my throat, weighed down by years of feeling misunderstood and undervalued by the people I was supposed to honor. They were good people, I managed finally. They deserved better than what happened to them. It was not eloquent or particularly insightful, but it was all I could manage in that moment. The grief was complicated by guilt. Guilt about the distance I had maintained. Guilt about the success that had created barriers between us. Guilt about feeling resentful, even in the face of such devastating loss. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Springfield look like a postcard. I dressed carefully in a black suit I had bought specifically for the occasion, wanting to look appropriate for the solemnity of the day, while also representing the professional success that had defined so much of my adult identity. The reflection in the hotel mirror showed a woman who looked successful and put together, but I could see the exhaustion and uncertainty in my own eyes. The funeral home was already crowded when I arrived, with parking spaces filled and a line of people waiting to sign the guest book. The sight of so many community members taking time from their Thursday morning to honor my parents was both touching and overwhelming. These were the people who had shared daily life with Mom and Dad, who had known them in ways I never would despite being their daughter. Inside the chapel, the caskets were surrounded by the floral arrangements I had ordered. Not ostentatious, but beautiful and dignified in a way that I hoped reflected my parents' worth. The program cover featured a photograph of my parents from their 40th wedding anniversary, looking happy and content in a way that captured the essence of their partnership. The inside pages listed the order of service, pallbearers, and family members, along with a brief biography that summarized their lives in Springfield. As people filed in and found seats, I noticed the natural segregation that had characterized so many family events over the years. My siblings and their families occupied the front rows, surrounded by the extended network of relatives, neighbors, and friends who had been part of my parents' daily lives. I sat with them, of course, but felt the familiar sense of being present, but not quite belonging in the same way the others did. The service began with hymns that had been Mom's favorites, songs I remembered from childhood Sundays at First Methodist Church. The pastor, Reverend Thompson, had known my parents for 25 years and spoke about them with the kind of personal knowledge that comes from sharing life's milestones over decades. He talked about their faithfulness to their community, their devotion to their family, and the quiet strength they had shown through various challenges over the years. Then came the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading, the family tributes. Danny stood first, representing himself and his sons. His speech was heartfelt and specific, filled with memories of fishing trips with Dad and cooking lessons with Mom, moments that painted a picture of grandparents who had been actively involved in their grandchildren's lives. The audience responded with knowing nods and occasional tears, recognizing the people they had known in Danny's descriptions. Lisa followed, speaking for herself and Laura. Her tribute focused on the lessons Mom had taught about hospitality and kindness, about the importance of family traditions and community involvement. She shared stories about holiday preparations, family recipes, and the way Mom had made everyone feel welcome in her home. Again, the audience connected with these memories, seeing their own experiences reflected in Lisa's words. Laura's tribute centered on Dad's role as a mentor and problem solver, someone who had taught practical skills and life lessons with equal patience. She talked about the workshop in the garage where Dad had taught all of his children and grandchildren to use tools, fix broken things, and approach problems with methodical thinking. These were the kinds of memories that resonated with a community where practical skills were valued and passed down through generations. Then it was my turn. I had prepared remarks that focused on my parents' influence on my work ethic and determination, the ways their example had motivated me to pursue excellence in my chosen field. But as I stood at the podium, looking out at a chapel filled with people who had known my parents in ways I had not, the words I had planned seemed inadequate. Instead, I found myself talking about the complexity of loving people, whose choices you do not always understand, and whose understanding of your choices remains incomplete. I spoke about the gift of parents, who had provided a foundation strong enough to support dreams they could not quite comprehend, and the challenge of honoring that foundation while building something different upon it. My parents gave me the security to take risks, I said, and the confidence to pursue opportunities they had never imagined. Even when they did not understand my choices, they never stopped loving me or believing in my ability to make my own way in the world. That kind of unconditional love is rare, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it. The response to my tribute was polite, but not as warm as the reactions to my siblings' speeches. I could feel the distance between my perspective and the shared memories that connected everyone else in the room. My success, which had seemed so important in the business world, felt irrelevant in the context of the lives my parents had actually lived and the community that had actually known them. After the service, we proceeded to East Lawn Cemetery for the burial. The autumn afternoon was beautiful, with the maple and oak trees creating a canopy of gold and crimson over the neat rows of headstones. My parents were being laid to rest in a section of the cemetery where many of their lifelong friends had already been buried, continuing the community connections that had defined their existence. The graveside service was brief but moving, with Reverend Thompson offering final prayers and the immediate family placing roses on the caskets before they were lowered into the ground. I stood between Lisa and Laura, holding their hands as we watched our parents disappear into the earth that had been their home for nearly 8 decades. The reception afterward, held in the fellowship hall of the funeral home, was a celebration of my parents' lives and their impact on the Springfield community. The food I had paid for, honey-glazed ham, green bean casserole, dinner rolls, and desserts, was consumed by more than 200 people who shared stories, exchanged contact information, and provided comfort to each other in the way that close-knit communities do. I moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and listening to stories about my parents' kindness, reliability, and generosity. People thanked me for arranging such a beautiful service, acknowledging the obvious expense and care that had gone into the arrangements, but even their gratitude felt somehow impersonal, as if they were thanking me for my financial contribution, rather than recognizing me as a grieving daughter. The moment that changed everything came near the end of the reception, when Reverend Thompson asked for everyone's attention to make some final remarks. He thanked the family for sharing Robert and Linda Mitchell with the community, and spoke about the legacy they had left through their children and grandchildren. Danny Mitchell has followed his father's example of hard work and dedication, building a career at the same plant where Robert worked for over 40 years. Lisa and Laura have embraced their mother's commitment to family and community, raising children who will carry forward the values Robert and Linda held dear. The Reverend paused, looking directly at me before continuing. The Mitchell family has been blessed with children who have honored their parents' memory in different ways, each contributing to the community that Robert and Linda loved so much. That was it. No mention of my name, no acknowledgement of my specific achievements, no recognition of the fact that I had paid for the entire funeral that had just honored my parents' memory. I was the unnamed child, the one whose contributions were acknowledged in the vaguest possible terms, while my siblings received specific recognition for choices that aligned with community values. The conversation continued around me, but I was no longer listening. I felt a familiar crushing sensation in my chest, the same feeling I had experienced countless times throughout my life, when my accomplishments were minimized or ignored by the people whose recognition I craved most. Even at my parents' funeral, even after paying for everything, I was still the family member who did not quite fit the narrative they wanted to tell about themselves. As people began to leave, and the cleanup process started, I found myself helping to pack up the remaining food and flowers with the same methodical efficiency I brought to business projects. My siblings thanked me repeatedly for covering the expenses, but their gratitude felt obligatory rather than heartfelt. We were already beginning to drift back into our separate lives, the temporary unity created by grief, giving way to the familiar patterns that had defined our relationships for decades. I drove back to Kansas City that evening in a state of emotional exhaustion, watching the familiar landscape of central Missouri disappear in my rearview mirror. The funeral was over, my parents were buried, and I was returning to the life I had built far from the community that had never quite known how to make room for me. But something fundamental had shifted during those 4 days in Springfield, something I was only beginning to understand. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and dark, except for the occasional truck stop or small town glowing in the distance. I had spent so many years traveling this route between my old life and my new one, always believing that success would eventually bridge the gap between where I came from and where I was going. But sitting in that chapel, listening to my achievements being acknowledged in the most generic terms possible, I realized that some gaps might be too wide to bridge, no matter how much money or success you accumulate. My parents were gone, taking with them any possibility of the recognition I had spent decades hoping to earn. The funeral I had paid for had become their final statement about who mattered in their family story, and once again, I had been relegated to the margins of that narrative. The question now was what to do with this devastating realization, and how to move forward with relationships that had been fundamentally shaped by this pattern of exclusion and misunderstanding. The weeks following the funeral passed in a haze of complicated grief and mounting resentment. I threw myself back into work with the kind of intensity that had built my company, but the familiar rhythms of meetings, client calls, and strategic planning felt hollow in ways I had never experienced before. The Kansas City skyline outside my office windows looked the same. The Missouri River still wound its way past the downtown district, but something essential had shifted in my relationship with the life I had constructed so carefully. My assistant noticed the change immediately. Sarah had worked for me for 8 years, managing my schedule and protecting my time with the kind of professional discretion that made her invaluable. She began scheduling fewer back-to-back meetings, quietly rearranging my calendar to allow for breaks that I probably needed but would never have requested. During our daily briefings, she would study my face with the concern of someone who had seen me navigate crises but had never witnessed this particular kind of exhaustion. The condolence cards arrived steadily for nearly 3 weeks, forwarded from Springfield by Danny, who had taken responsibility for handling my parents' mail and closing their accounts. Most were from people I barely remembered: former neighbors, church members, co-workers from Dad's decades at the Ford plant. They contained the usual expressions of sympathy and brief memories of my parents' kindness or reliability. Reading them felt like discovering a parallel version of my parents' lives, one where they were beloved community figures whose loss created genuine grief among people who had known them in ways I never would. A few cards mentioned the beautiful funeral service, thanking the family for the lovely tribute to Robert and Linda Mitchell. One elderly neighbor wrote about how meaningful it had been to see the community come together to honor 2 people who had given so much to Springfield over the years. Another mentioned the elegant floral arrangements and the abundance of food at the reception, noting how much my parents would have appreciated the care that had gone into every detail. None of the cards mentioned my name specifically, or acknowledged my role in making the service possible. Even in death, my parents' community saw my contributions as family efforts rather than individual actions. The pattern that had defined my relationship with Springfield continued even after the people who mattered most to me were no longer alive to witness it. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Danny that would force me to confront the financial and emotional complexities of my parents' estate. He had been working with their attorney, a Springfield lawyer named William Hartley, who had handled their wills and basic estate planning for the past 15 years. The preliminary review of their assets and debts had revealed some unexpected complications. "Rebecca, we need to talk about the house and their finances," Danny said during our Thursday evening phone call. "Can you come down this weekend? Bill Hartley wants to meet with all of us together." The drive to Springfield on Saturday morning felt different from all the previous trips I had made over the years. This time, I was not visiting my parents' home, but rather dealing with their property, a distinction that made the familiar landscape seem foreign and somehow final. The autumn colors had deepened since the funeral, creating the kind of scenic beauty that Missouri tourism boards used in their promotional materials. But I was no longer a daughter coming home. I was a beneficiary attending to business. The meeting took place in Hartley's downtown office, a converted Victorian house that had probably been elegant in its residential days, but now felt cramped and outdated as a professional space. The waiting room was decorated with hunting prints and photographs of local landmarks, creating an atmosphere that was determinedly traditional and proudly regional. I felt conspicuous in my tailored business suit, a reminder that I belonged to a different world than the one where my parents' legal affairs were being settled. Hartley was a man in his 60s with the kind of local connections that made him invaluable for navigating Springfield's business and social networks. He had known my parents through church and community activities, giving him a personal investment in handling their estate with care and discretion. When he spoke about Robert and Linda Mitchell, it was with the genuine fondness of someone who had considered them friends as well as clients. The financial picture he presented was both better and worse than I had expected. My parents had been careful savers throughout their working years, accumulating modest but significant assets through decades of consistent contributions to retirement accounts and conservative investments. Dad's pension from the Ford plant, combined with Social Security, and Mom's small inheritance from her own parents, had provided them with comfortable security during their retirement years. The house on Elm Street was worth approximately $120,000 according to recent comparable sales in the neighborhood. It was mortgage-free, having been paid off during Dad's final years at the plant. Their savings and investment accounts totaled another $85,000, money they had never touched during retirement because their fixed income had been sufficient for their modest lifestyle. The complication came in the form of debts that nobody in the family had known about. My parents had been quietly helping Lisa and Laura with various financial emergencies over the past 3 years. Loans that had been formalized through Hartley's office but had never been discussed openly within the family. Lisa owed them $18,000 for home repairs after a roof leak had caused extensive damage. Laura owed $22,000, accumulated through a series of smaller loans related to her husband's unemployment and their children's medical expenses. "Your parents structured these as formal loans with reasonable interest rates," Hartley explained, shuffling through documents that detailed payment schedules and terms. But according to their instructions, these debts were to be forgiven upon their deaths. They didn't want their daughters to inherit financial burdens along with their grief. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My parents had been lending money to my sisters, while I had been excluded from both the knowledge of their financial struggles and the family's response to those struggles. Even more painful was the realization that my parents had planned to forgive these debts, demonstrating a level of generosity toward Lisa and Laura that had never been extended to me. Not that I had needed financial help, but the asymmetry of treatment felt like yet another confirmation of my peripheral status in the family's emotional landscape. Danny shifted uncomfortably as Hartley continued his explanation. "The total estate value is approximately $205,000, minus final expenses and taxes. According to the will, everything is to be divided equally among the 4 children after specific bequests to grandchildren." The math was straightforward. After funeral expenses, attorney fees, and taxes, each of us would inherit roughly $45,000, along with personal items that held sentimental rather than monetary value. It was a respectable legacy for people who had worked modest jobs and lived careful lives, but it was also a fraction of what I spent on my car or what I contributed to charity each year. What made the inheritance emotionally complicated was not the amount, but the accompanying letter my parents had left with Hartley, to be read aloud during the estate settlement meeting. Mom had written it in her careful cursive handwriting, probably during one of the quiet evenings when she had worked on various household projects, while Dad watched television in his recliner. "My dear children," Hartley read, his voice taking on the formal tone appropriate for such moments. "If you are hearing this letter, It means your father and I are no longer with you to say these things in person. We want you to know how proud we are of the adults you have become and the families you have built. Danny, you have shown the same dedication to hard work and family that your father valued throughout his life. Lisa and Laura, you have embraced the roles of wife and mother, with the same love and commitment I tried to bring to those responsibilities. We are confident that you will continue to be pillars of the Springfield community and examples for your children of what it means to live with integrity and purpose. The letter continued with specific mentions of grandchildren, hopes for their futures, and instructions about distributing family heirlooms. There were detailed descriptions of which grandchild should receive Dad's tools, which should inherit Mom's china, and how various photographs and keepsakes should be shared among the extended family. Then came the paragraph that would haunt me for months afterward. We also want to acknowledge our daughter who chose a different path in life. We may not have always understood her choices, but we recognize that she has achieved success in ways that were beyond our experience. We hope she will remember us fondly and perhaps find ways to stay connected to the family and community that shaped her early years. That was it. No mention of my name, no specific acknowledgement of my achievements, no personal words of love or pride. I was the unnamed daughter whose success was noted but not celebrated, whose connection to family was presented as something to be hoped for rather than treasured. Even in their final written words to their children, my parents had maintained the pattern of treating me as someone whose place in the family narrative was uncertain and conditional. The silence in Hartley's office stretched uncomfortably as everyone processed what had just been read. Danny cleared his throat and mumbled something about how Mom and Dad had loved all of us, but his words felt obligatory rather than convincing. Lisa and Laura avoided making eye contact with me, perhaps understanding for the first time how differently our parents had viewed my role in the family compared to theirs. I maintained my composure through the rest of the meeting, signing the necessary paperwork and making arrangements for the distribution of assets. But inside, I was reeling from the cumulative impact of being excluded, minimized, and treated as an afterthought even in my parents' final formal communication to their children. The pattern that had defined our relationship for decades had been preserved and documented for posterity, ensuring that future generations would understand exactly how Robert and Linda Mitchell had viewed their successful but distant daughter. The drive back to Kansas City that afternoon was one of the longest of my life. I stopped twice at rest areas along Interstate 44, not because I needed gas or food, but because I needed to sit in my car and process the emotional magnitude of what I had just experienced. The rolling farmland of central Missouri, which had always represented the roots I had worked so hard to transcend, now felt like evidence of connections I had never successfully made and never would be able to repair. That evening, I sat in my penthouse apartment overlooking the Missouri River, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my professional success, but feeling more isolated than I had since my early struggling years in Kansas City. The city lights sparkled below my windows, representing the opportunities and achievements that had defined my adult identity, but none of it seemed to matter in the face of my parents' final assessment of my worth as their daughter. I opened a bottle of wine that had been a gift from a client, something expensive and rare that my parents would never have purchased or appreciated. As I sat drinking it alone, I realized that this moment represented everything that had gone wrong in my relationship with my family. I had the resources to buy things they could not afford, the education to understand things they had never studied, and the professional success they had never quite comprehended. But I did not have their love and recognition in the way that my siblings did, and no amount of money or achievement was going to change that fundamental reality. The next few weeks brought a series of small humiliations that reinforced my understanding of my place in the family hierarchy. Lisa called to discuss the distribution of Mom's jewelry, explaining that she and Laura had already decided which pieces each of them would keep based on sentimental value and family tradition. I was welcome to choose from the remaining items, but it was clear that the most meaningful pieces had already been claimed by daughters who had stayed closer to home and maintained more intimate relationships with our mother. Laura contacted me about Dad's workshop, asking if I wanted any of his tools before they distributed them among the male grandchildren who had shown interest in woodworking and mechanical projects. The offer was made with genuine consideration, but it highlighted once again how thoroughly I had been excluded from the practical knowledge and shared activities that had connected other family members across generations. Danny handled the sale of the house, coordinating with a local realtor and managing the process of clearing out decades of accumulated possessions. He kept me informed of major decisions, but clearly did not expect me to participate in the day-to-day work of emptying rooms and sorting through belongings. My geographical distance made active participation difficult, but I sensed that my involvement was not particularly welcome even if logistics had allowed for it. The house sold quickly to a young family with small children, people who appreciated the solid construction and established neighborhood that had provided security for my parents throughout their adult lives. The new owners planned to update the kitchen and bathrooms, but preserve the basic character that had made it home for the Mitchell family for nearly 50 years. I was glad that it would continue to shelter a family, but the sale felt like the final erasure of my connection to Springfield and the life my parents had built there. When the estate was finally settled 3 months after the funeral, I received a check for $47,000, along with a small box of items that had been designated as mine. The box contained my high school yearbooks, some photographs from my childhood, a few pieces of costume jewelry that had belonged to Mom, and my undergraduate diploma, which my parents had apparently saved, despite never displaying it prominently in their home. Looking through these remnants of my early life, I was struck by how little physical evidence remained of my connection to the Mitchell family. My siblings had inherited furniture, dishes, tools, and other household items that would become part of their daily lives and family traditions. I had photographs and documents that would probably end up in storage, meaningful to me, but unlikely to be treasured by future generations who would have no context for understanding their significance. The diploma was particularly poignant. It was rolled in the original tube from the University of Missouri, suggesting that my parents had never framed it or given it the kind of prominent display that other family achievements had received. They had kept it, which indicated some level of pride in my accomplishment, but they had never integrated it into the visual narrative of family success that decorated their living room walls. That evening, I made a decision that had been building in my mind since the estate meeting. I wrote checks totaling $47,000 to 3 charities that supported educational opportunities for first-generation college students from rural communities. The money that represented my inheritance from parents who had never fully understood or celebrated my achievements would now help other young people pursue dreams that might seem impossible from the perspective of small-town limitations. It felt like the right way to honor both my parents' memory and my own journey, even if they would never know about the gesture. The money would create opportunities for students who faced the same cultural barriers I had encountered, helping them bridge the gap between where they came from and where they wanted to go. It was a tribute that reflected my values, rather than the expectations that had shaped my parents' view of appropriate success. 3 days after I mailed the charity checks, I received a phone call that would bring the emotional complexity of my relationship with my family into sharp focus. Lisa was calling to let me know about a conversation she had with one of Mom's longtime friends, a woman named Dorothy Henderson who had been part of my parents' church circle for over 30 years. "Dorothy mentioned something that I thought you should know," Lisa said, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when discussing sensitive family matters. "She said Mom used to talk about you quite a bit, especially in the last few years." I felt my stomach tighten as I prepared for whatever revelation was coming. Conversations about me within my parents' social circle were rarely flattering, usually focusing on my unmarried status, my childless condition, or my decision to prioritize career over family in ways that their generation found difficult to understand. "What kind of things did she say?" I asked. "According to Dorothy, Mom was actually very proud of your success, but she worried that bragging about your money and achievements would make other people uncomfortable. She didn't want to seem like she was showing off or making other parents feel bad about their children's more modest accomplishments." The words hit me with unexpected force. The possibility that my parents had been proud of me, but had chosen to minimize their pride out of social consideration, was somehow more painful than simple disapproval would have been. It suggested that my achievements had been recognized but deliberately downplayed, celebrated privately but hidden publicly in deference to community norms that valued humility over ambition. "Dorothy said Mom would light up when she talked about your business and all the people you employed. She used to say that you had inherited Dad's work ethic, but applied it in ways they never could have imagined. She was proud that you had made something of yourself, but she didn't know how to talk about it without sounding like she was putting on airs." I sat in my office chair, looking out at the Kansas City skyline while processing this information that reframed decades of feeling unrecognized and undervalued. The pattern I had interpreted as indifference or disappointment had actually been a complex negotiation between private pride and public modesty, shaped by cultural expectations about appropriate ways to discuss family success. "Why didn't she ever tell me any of this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think she assumed you knew," Lisa replied. "You were so successful and confident that she probably thought you didn't need the same kind of encouragement she gave the rest of us. She used to say that you were the strong one who could take care of yourself, while the rest of us needed more support and guidance." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Lisa sharing other comments Dorothy had remembered about my parents' private discussions of their children. Apparently, Mom had worried that my success had come at the cost of personal relationships, hoping that I would eventually find someone to share my life with, but respecting my independence too much to pressure me about it. Dad had expressed pride in my determination and intelligence, comparing me to his own mother who had been a strong woman ahead of her time. These were the conversations I had never heard, the expressions of love and pride that had been shared within my parents' social circle, but never communicated directly to me. The irony was devastating. I had spent decades craving recognition that had actually existed, but had been filtered through cultural expectations that made direct expressions seem inappropriate or potentially harmful to community relationships. After the call ended, I sat in my office as the sun set over Kansas City, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness. The revelation that my parents had been proud of me, but had chosen not to express that pride publicly, created a new layer of grief that was somehow more complex than simple rejection would have been. They had loved me and celebrated my achievements, but they had done so in ways that preserved their relationships with a community that might not have understood or approved of my choices. The funeral, with its careful omission of my name and achievements, now seemed like the final expression of this lifelong pattern. Even in death, my parents had maintained the social boundaries that had shaped their approach to discussing my success. The Reverend's generic acknowledgement of my contributions had been designed to honor my role in the family, while avoiding the kind of specific recognition that might have made other community members uncomfortable. Understanding the motivation behind my parents' behavior did not eliminate the pain of having been excluded from public family narratives for so many years. But it did help me see that their love had been more complex than I had realized, shaped by generational and cultural factors that had made direct expression difficult. They had been caught between pride in my achievements and loyalty to a community that valued different kinds of success, choosing to preserve community harmony at the cost of making me feel fully recognized and celebrated. The question now was, what to do with this new understanding of my parents' perspective and my place in the family story they had tried so carefully to manage. That night, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I would return to Springfield one more time, not for a family obligation or crisis, but to have the conversations with my siblings that we had been avoiding since the funeral. The emotional distance that had characterized our relationships for decades needed to be addressed directly, honestly, and with the kind of courage that had driven my professional success, but had been absent from my family interactions. I had spent my entire adult life building a successful business by confronting difficult situations head-on, analyzing problems objectively, and implementing solutions that served long-term interests rather than short-term comfort. The dysfunction in my family relationships required the same kind of strategic thinking and direct communication, even if the emotional stakes were higher than any business deal I had ever negotiated. The drive to Springfield the following weekend felt different from all the previous trips I had made over the years. This time, I was not responding to a crisis or fulfilling an obligation, but instead taking control of a situation that had been shaped by decades of avoidance and miscommunication. I had called Danny to arrange a meeting with all 3 siblings, explaining that I wanted to discuss our family dynamics and find ways to build better relationships going forward. The conversation took place in Lisa's living room on a Sunday afternoon, with her children occupied in the backyard and her husband diplomatically absent. The setting was informal, but the atmosphere was tense, weighted with years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings that none of us had been willing to address directly. I began by acknowledging the elephant that had been in the room throughout our adult lives, the fact that my success had created barriers and complications that we had never learned how to navigate effectively. I talked about feeling excluded from family narratives and minimized in family discussions, but I also acknowledged that my geographical distance and different lifestyle had made it difficult for them to know how to include me. "I don't think any of us intended for things to turn out this way," I said, looking at each of my siblings in turn. "But we've created patterns that make it hard for us to have real relationships with each other." I want to understand your perspectives and find ways to be better siblings going forward." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Danny admitted that my success had sometimes made him feel inadequate, especially during his divorce when financial pressures had highlighted the difference in our circumstances. Lisa and Laura acknowledged that they had sometimes resented my ability to solve problems with money while they struggled with budgets and debt. But they also shared their own perspectives on the family dynamics that had shaped our relationships. They had felt pressure to stay close to home and fulfill traditional expectations, while I had been free to pursue opportunities they had never felt able to consider. They had been responsible for providing emotional support and practical help to our aging parents, while I had been able to maintain distance and visit on my own terms. "We always knew Mom and Dad were proud of you," Laura said quietly, "but they worried that talking about your success would make it seem like they valued money more than family, or that they thought you were better than the rest of us somehow. They used to say that you were the one who got away," Danny added, "but I think they meant it as a compliment, not as criticism. They were proud that you had built something bigger than what Springfield could offer, even if they didn't always know how to talk about it." The conversation lasted for nearly 3 hours, covering years of accumulated misunderstandings and missed opportunities for connection. We talked about specific incidents that had hurt feelings on all sides, family gatherings where someone had felt excluded or dismissed, and the ways our different life choices had created barriers to understanding each other's experiences. By the end of the afternoon, we had not solved all the problems that had developed over decades of poor communication, but we had established a foundation for building better relationships based on honest acknowledgement of our differences and mutual respect for the choices we had made. We agreed to make more effort to stay in touch, to include each other in significant life events, and to address conflicts directly rather than allowing them to fester through years of avoidance. Most importantly, we acknowledged that our parents had loved all of us, but had struggled to navigate the complexities created by our different paths in life. Their failure to mention my name at the funeral had been consistent with a lifelong pattern of managing family dynamics by minimizing differences rather than celebrating them. It was not a reflection of their lack of love for me, but rather a reflection of their inability to find ways to honor my achievements without disrupting the community relationships that had sustained them throughout their lives. Understanding this context did not eliminate the pain of having felt excluded and undervalued for so many years, but it did provide a framework for moving forward with relationships that could be based on adult understanding rather than childhood grievances. My siblings and I were different people who had made different choices, but we were also family members who shared history and could choose to share future experiences if we approached our relationships with more honesty and less defensiveness. The drive back to Kansas City that evening felt lighter than it had in years. The familiar landscape of central Missouri looked less like evidence of limitations I had overcome, and more like the foundation that had made my achievements possible. My parents had given me security, education, and values that had enabled me to pursue opportunities they could not have imagined. The fact that they had struggled to celebrate my success publicly did not diminish the importance of what they had provided privately. As I crossed the Missouri River and saw the Kansas City skyline rising ahead of me, I realized that this city no longer represented escape from my family, but rather the fulfillment of possibilities they had made available to me. My success was not a rejection of my parents' values, but an extension of their commitment to hard work, integrity, and making the most of available opportunities. The distance between Springfield and Kansas City was not a measure of my rejection of family, but rather evidence of how far those foundational values could carry someone when combined with ambition and favorable circumstances. The question that remained was how to honor both my parents' memory and my own achievements while building relationships with my siblings that acknowledged our differences without being defined by them. The funeral had been their final statement about family priorities and community values. Now it was time for me to write my own statement about what it meant to be Robert and Linda Mitchell's daughter, even if that statement looked different from the narratives they had been comfortable sharing with their Springfield community. 6 months after the funeral, I received a call that changed everything. Margaret Williams, principal of Springfield Elementary, where Mom had volunteered for 20 years, had discovered something remarkable. "Your mother quietly established a fund to help struggling families with school supplies and clothes," Margaret explained. She contributed $200 monthly from her Social Security, insisting it remain anonymous. She always talked about having a daughter who proved education could change everything. Once again, I was learning about my parents' pride in me through someone else. Mom had been using my success as inspiration while helping other children pursue education. She understood what I had accomplished, even if she never said so directly. That afternoon, I called Margaret back with a proposal. I would establish the Robert and Linda Mitchell Education Fund with $100,000, continuing Mom's work while expanding it to include college scholarships for first-generation students from working families. Everything would remain anonymous, honoring Mom's belief that helping others should be private, not public recognition. The fund ceremony took place at the school 6 weeks later. My siblings attended, along with Mom's church friends who had known about her charitable work. When Margaret asked me to speak, I finally found the words that had escaped me at the funeral. My parents taught me that success means making opportunities possible for others, I said. This fund is their legacy, not mine. I'm just continuing work they started. Danny approached me afterward with genuine respect. I never realized how much you understood what they really valued. They would have loved this. For the first time, my siblings saw my success not as separation from family values, but as an extension of them. My resources enabled me to honor our parents' traditions in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. In the months that followed, I began regular visits to Springfield, not for crises, but to maintain relationships we had allowed to deteriorate. I also started mentoring high school students interested in technology careers, sharing guidance I wished I had received as a teenager. One conversation particularly moved me. Ashley Torres, a senior whose factory worker parents questioned her programming ambitions, reminded me exactly of my younger self. Her parents loved her, but feared choices they could not understand. Your parents want security for you, I told her, but security can come from following your talents, not just safe paths. We spent an hour discussing scholarships and career planning, but more importantly, strategies for helping her parents understand that modern success often requires risks they could not evaluate. 3 months later, Ashley sent a thank you note from the University of Missouri, where she had been accepted with a full scholarship. You helped me realize I could honor my family while pursuing my own path, she wrote. Reading her note, I finally understood what my parents had been showing me through example rather than words. Success was not about escaping your background but taking foundational values, hard work, integrity, service, and applying them in ways that expanded opportunities for others. My parents never mentioned my name at the funeral because they never needed to. My achievements were already woven into who they were and what they contributed to their community. The money I spent on their funeral was not purchasing recognition. It was a final gift from a daughter whose success had always been their success, even when they struggled to express that connection. The Robert and Linda Mitchell Education Fund now helps 23 students annually. Recipients never learn my name, maintaining the anonymous generosity Mom practiced throughout her life. But every spring, when Margaret sends reports about fund recipients, I am reminded that my parents' legacy continues creating possibilities for young people whose dreams might seem unrealistic from small-town perspectives. My relationship with my siblings has evolved into something honest and sustainable. We no longer pretend geography and choices have not created differences, but we have learned to value those differences rather than allowing them to create barriers. Danny calls for business advice. Lisa and Laura include me in family celebrations. I share details about my work that help them understand who I have become, not just what I have achieved. Most importantly, I have learned that being excluded from my parents' funeral narrative was not rejection, but protection, their way of preserving community relationships while privately celebrating achievements they could not publicly explain. Their love was more complex than I realized, shaped by generational expectations that made direct recognition difficult. Now, when I drive through central Missouri, I no longer see landscape representing limitations I overcame, but foundation that made my achievements possible. My parents gave me security, education, and values that enabled me to pursue opportunities they could not imagine. Their struggle to celebrate my success publicly did not diminish what they provided privately. The funeral was their final statement about family priorities. But this fund is my statement about what it means to be Robert and Linda Mitchell's daughter, someone who uses success not for personal recognition, but for creating opportunities others might not otherwise have. Their names are not on buildings or monuments, but their values live on through students who carry forward the belief that education can transform lives across generations. That is the recognition that truly matters, the legacy that honors both their memory and the foundation they provided for everything I have been able to accomplish. In the end, my name did not need to be mentioned at their funeral. Their influence on my life speaks through every scholarship awarded, every student encouraged, every opportunity created for young people who dare to dream beyond the limitations of their circumstances. That is how Robert and Linda Mitchell's daughter chooses to be remembered, not for what she achieved alone, but for what she made possible for others.